Okay guys, it's Timmer, your old pal, and I am here to do a quick follow-up update, the post-jam show you could say, for our first lab, which introduced people to React in our real-world React course. So everything went really great. Let's dive on into Leaflet Learning here for a moment. And we're going to jump into the real-world React. We'll do a quick review of our lab 1 that we did in the live streams. If you haven't seen it, you might want to jump on that on YouTube. Let's bring up the lesson pen here. You can see we've filled up nicely with students here. Got a lot of people wanting to learn React. If we jump into the lesson pen, we can see that over here in the JavaScript, we've made some simple components here. So this first component we made is called the stateless function, and it is probably the simplest thing that you will make in React, but very, very important. In fact, in a real world scenario, your React application is probably going to be composed about 90% of these stateless functions. So let's skip down here, because what I wanted to get to was what we did in the later part of the class, which was an introduction to unit testing. And I think this is maybe the only part here that freaked people out a little bit, because some folks have not really done much unit testing. Now, what is a unit test, and why would we want to do unit testing? And let's get down to it here. So a unit test is basically a small piece of testing code that runs a test on some piece of our functional code and expects a predictable result back. So if you had a function that added 1 + 1, well, you could unit test that, because you can predict that the result is always going to be 2, and it should always be 2. And when you run the unit test, if it comes back with the 2, then the test passes, otherwise it fails. So in theory, it's a fairly simple thing. But why would you do unit testing? Well, in some environments, they don't really do a lot of unit testing, but in any environment where the software is being created, where a product is being created, unit testing is always a good idea, because it ensures code quality, right? You don't have just a few unit tests. You wind up with unit tests for pretty much every piece of that application. And anytime a build is being done, the unit tests will automatically run, and they all have to pass, or it will stop that build from completing, which is really important, because this assures that we're not interrupting user experience with random bugs popping up that got introduced, as happens as an application grows in complexity. So I think even from the beginning, it's pretty important to get used to the idea of unit testing. The other benefit of unit testing is the way that it changes your development. It does this by ensuring that you have proper specifications for every piece of code that you're working on. So we talked about this a little bit in class. We talked about agile development, and how user stories turn into use case scenarios, which get translated into unit tests, which are often written before your functional code, actually. So enough talking about what it is and why you would do it. Let's review the example that we did in the first lab here. We've got a simple unit test going on. First off, let's look at the component. So here we're looking at first component, and we've got our arrow function here, ES6 style arrow function, that does one simple little thing. It just returns this little H1 that says, "Hi, Mom." And if I look down below here, we can see that there's an area at the bottom of my page which says Jasmine, and it says this has one specification with 0 failures. Now look at test number 1 here, where it says render my component, and then sure enough, it renders an H1. So this is a passing test. Let's make it fail. If I go back up here and I change this from an H1 to maybe like a H3. Let's see what the result is. Well, look at that. See how that failed right away? So this is a very, very simple example, but this totally works, right? Because like maybe something else was counting on that being an H1. Like for instance, styles. Let's say we've got some CSS styles and they're targeted towards an H1 and I just change it to an H3. Well, there should be some kind of an indication that that's going to have implications in our application. So that seems to be working. Let's change it back to the H1 and then we're going to scroll down and take a look at the testing area. All right, so that's back to the way it should be. Tests are passing. We head on down to the testing area. Maybe I can shrink this down just so we can get a better look at this thing, because creating unit tests is fairly predictable. To do it, you need a few pieces. One, you need something called a test runner. So this is just a piece of software that will run all the tests. In this case, we are using Jasmine. Jasmine is very simple and popular because it's kind of an all-in-one solution. It includes one of the other tools we need, which is called an assertion library. An assertion library is used in the expectations of the unit test. What I mean by that is, if you expect 1 + 1 to equal 2, well, equal, that's kind of one of your assertions. Now, different testing suites, they follow different methodologies in this regard. Jasmine has it included in it, which is why I kind of like it, because it's a little bit simpler for people who are new to unit testing. But there are others like Mocha, for instance, and Mocha allows you to set the testing library, the assertion library that you want to use. So you've got more options. But that's just a quick summary of that. Let's go down. And we can look at the second helpful thing that we have that is specific to React, which is these React add-ons, test utilities that we see right down here. Okay, so we're creating a constant variable called test utils, which is pointed at the React test utilities. So this gets to the heart of why unit testing is so good with React. In class yesterday, we talked about the fact that React uses a virtual DOM and thus keeps us from updating the actual DOM. Now this is great for unit testing because it's always been difficult to unit test the DOM. Think about it. The DOM isn't the same for all browsers and for all versions of browsers. So when we run tests inside of React, we're looking towards the virtual DOM, which is actually standardized across all of the browsers. So that's super, super helpful for us. It makes our job a lot easier if we're creating unit tests. And then, you know, the Facebook team went one step further and they provided even a full suite of utilities to make it even easier. So let's look at how we're using these here. So we've got our test utilities, we've got our assertion library built in with Jasmine, and we've created one more little thing here, a wrapper class, which is extending React component. So there may be updates to the React utilities. They were created at the time when we didn't really have stateless functions. So for now, at least, we basically have to take any of our components that are stateless functions and put them inside of stateful functions, like this little wrapper we're doing here. So it doesn't do a lot. It basically just, you know, has a render function that renders out anything we give it, including our stateless functions. So if we head on down here, we're finally getting into the testing area. So first off, we describe the test. Now, unit tests wind up sounding almost like plain language, which is, you know, pretty cool because as I was mentioning, and we'll get into further, you can actually make unit tests right out of use case scenarios. So you can use these to actually spec out your project quite well. Right here, I'm saying test number 1 should just render the component. Okay, so that's the category of tests that I'm running. Now, right after that, notice that we've got the word it. And we've got another descriptive sentence here that says it should render an H1. And then we've got an arrow function. All right, so that's the way it works. You first describe the set of tests that you want to do. Then you describe each individual test. So that is called a spec. So if we look again in the output of Jasmine, we see that we have one spec with 0 failures. So here's our one spec where we want to try and render an H1. So the first thing we do is set up the preconditions of the test. Right here, we just make a variable called component, and then we're using those utilities and a particular function called render into document. Okay, so this is how we use React to work with that virtual DOM. And what's going to do is actually take the component that we put inside of our wrapper here and insert it invisibly into the virtual DOM, and then looking at what actual DOM element is created by doing that. Now, we don't access that directly. What we do is we use the utilities again with a corresponding function call here, find rendered DOM component with tag, which is, you know, a little verbose, but pretty accurate in terms of description. Okay, so what we're going to do is give it the component we created, and then we're going to say we're looking for the tag H1. Great, we've got our precondition. We've now set the realm that we are actually conducting our test on. And finally, we get to the expectation. Now, this is, you know, what we expect when we perform this operation. Right here, we call expect. We give it that H1, and we say to be defined. So this to be defined is an example of the assertion library that we're using that is built in to Jasmine. And we're basically saying, like, if it's not defined, this fails, which is why when I changed my component to be an H3 rather than an H1, my unit test failed. So in the real world, how this might be handled inside of an agile development team, we have a user story, something like, you know, hockey fans want to see latest hockey scores. This will move along to something called a use case scenario, which is a little more specific in defining the actual user elements that would be involved in achieving that user story. And each line item inside of that use case scenario can usually be turned into a spec like we see here. So the person writing unit tests can actually go in there and say, okay, here's what we expect to see from whatever you make, Mr. Developer. We can then give the use case scenario as well as the unit test to the developer. And, you know, this is great because it means that they can exercise their own freedom in the way that they implement this thing. They don't have to be micromanaged or have somebody watching over their shoulder. So I think it's well worth learning and, you know, well worth implementing in environments where, you know, the product is software. So let's take a quick look at a student and see what they're doing with this thing. Let's dive back in here, and I'm going to visit, let's see, let's take a look at Mr. Amrit here. So I'm going to jump into the review area, and let's see. Hey, look at that. He's got his testing unit working right inside of here. Let's open this up on CodePen, do a quickie little review of what he's got going on here. All right. I notice he's made a little small customization on this CSS here. And he's got his first component. It looks like syntax is all good. He says, "Hi, Tim." Ah. All right, so let's go down to his testing unit here. And let's see what he's got. So we're looking for a few things. We're looking for, he needs to instantiate the test utilities. He needs to create a wrapper because, you know, this is a stateless function that he's working with. He needs to put that stateless function inside the wrapper in the preconditions. He needs to define the test itself. And then he needs to, you know, do the expectation and assertion at the end of it. Let's see what he's got. All right. Check 1. He's got the test utils. Awesome. Check 2. He's got a wrapper, you know, and we can use these for all the unit tests. Let's see. Description. Yeah, he's got a basic description right down here. And then he's got this actual unit test that should render an H1. That's all looking pretty good. There's his component sitting inside the wrapper. Nice. And then down here we've got the find rendered DOM component with tag, which gives us this H1, and then he's applying his assertion against it. So looking pretty good. Now this doesn't stray too far from the example that we did in class, which I think is okay in this case because this is a very new concept for a lot of people. And Amrit's done a pretty good job of following along with this, and hopefully in the next couple of labs we'll get people more familiar with unit tests. To that end, you might want to take a look at some of the little challenges that we've got over here in the resources. I'd recommend this first one called These Are My Donkeys. This has a couple of different things that you can try. So for instance, right up here, we can see first off that we've got 4 specs and one of them is failing. So you're going to need to go in there and find the one that's failing and figure out why it is failing. So maybe I can give you a couple of hints and get you started on that. Let's go down and take a look in the unit test, just like we would do if we were working on a project here. Okay, so we've got this first one that renders out a first component into the virtual DOM. And down here, it says it expects there to be an H1. It wants the H1 to be defined, but there's a second expectation here. You see, unit tests, they don't have just one expectation, they can have many. So right here, we're saying we're expecting that the inner HTML, that H1, should contain visitor. Well, does it? Just looking in the DOM here, I can plainly see that it does not. If I go back up to the beginning, and I look for that first component, let's put in the word visitor. And now our test is passing. And there's a couple more challenges in there as well. And there's 2 more. The last one here, if you're really liking this testing stuff, actually gets you into writing some of your own unit tests. Awesome thing to do if you can do it. Okay, so that's just the beginning, and you know, we've got a lot more coming up here. 13 more labs inside of the series. So I just want to mention that you know, don't forget, if you're looking to make cool software, Oddly Studios is a great partner to have. That's my company and the folks that I work with, and we're, you know, pretty big on developing software. And the second thing I'll mention is that leafletlearning.com is for training. So if you're interested in learning to build the software yourself, that's going to be your resource. We've got new classes starting up in September, including the next round of Real World React. So if that's something you've been looking to get into, you know, you could do great if you take this course. So you might want to register right now. You're going to go to app.leafletlearning.com and register, so that you can see upcoming courses and get in there early. Okay, guys, it's been great making the post-jam show, and I look forward to the next lesson, which is going to get us making some pretty cool stuff, learning how to do layout and styling of React components using a brand new, super cool library called the Styled Components Library. This is brand new. Like, this has only popped up on my radar in the last couple of months, so I'm really excited to show you guys that. I think you're going to love it. See you soon.